So I hope you support the Wiener Amendment by taking from ours and putting in the streets of your district. And then I think it's late. Let's fold up the rest of the bill. Let's go back. Let's have some bipartisan discussion, try to figure out the way to do this in a way that the President won't veto. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Virginia.
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
That if the President of the United States had not failed to do what he was elected to do, that was to lead this country by rejecting the Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson Commission recommendation. President Obama supported and appointed the people to the Bowles-Simpson Commission. And we have seen in the State of the Union message he walked away. None of the cuts that are being done tonight would have to be done had the President done what he should have done with regard to the Simpson-Bowles Commission. I have said that if I had been appointed to the Simpson-Bowles Commission, I would have been supportive of it. And if Tom Coburn and Dick Durbin can be in support of it, hopefully we can come together in a bipartisan. But all of the opposition would not even have to take place if the President had failed to provide the leadership that he has failed to done. This bill makes deliberate choices within NASA to strike an appropriate balance between achieving budget savings, procurement support for NASA's $16 billion in annual contract safety mission assurance, prevent spaceflight accidents. To do this, you would almost guarantee that something could potentially happen. IT security to prevent the Chinese from having cyber attacks. We had hearings the other day that China has had cyber attacks against NASA's computer. This amendment would say it's okay, we can have the cyber attacks, we're going to put it somewhere else. In addition, this amendment, I see the gentlelady from Houston was here, this amendment will call NASA's civil servants and contractors between 1,500 and 2,000 jobs. Had President Obama done what he should have done by appointing that commission, we wouldn't even have any cuts here. We would have been doing what we had to do. Willie Sutton said, since we're talking about crime, Willie Sutton said he robbed banks. And the reason he robbed banks was that's where the money is. The money is in the entitlements. Had we dealt with the Obama Commission of Bowles and Simpson, we would not be where we are today. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Willie Sutton would love it if the cops weren't trying to protect the banks. That'd be great. But the cops are important. My first job at a law school was attorney for the Memphis Police Department. And one of the first things I learned is the best deterrent to crime is patrol. And patrol is policemen on the beat. That's the most effective way to reduce crime. And when you have high unemployment, when you have a great recession like we've experienced with high unemployment, crime naturally does go up. And when you have crime up, you need more cops to protect property and individuals and lives. This COPS program has been successful. It was successful in the 90s. It saw a tremendous decrease in crime. And as Mr. Wiener pointed out, and I praise him for being the champion of this for so many years, this has been an effective program that has saved lives and property, kept insurance rates down, and kept ordered liberty in our country. Willie Sutton would not be for this amendment. He'd like to see the cops off the street, away from the banks, away from the widows, away from the children, away from everybody who is in the arms of a potential crime, in the way of a potential crime, and that's something we shouldn't have in this country. The cost of this program to get rid of it would be tremendous. The fact is the COPS program saves money, and this amendment zeroes out the COPS program. It isn't a simple change because limiting some of the monies. It eliminates the program, and that's a mistake. Local police are struggling with shrinking budgets. Tax rates are down as people have spent less money. So we don't have the money to support our police and to keep our law enforcement in the levels in which it should be. And to cut police and law enforcement is a mistake, a serious mistake that's going to cost the American people. You can't put it down in dollars and cents. Lives will be lost. Property will be lost. Insurance rates will go up. And this is one place among others, but particularly here, we're the first line of defense. The police powers of the state. The first one is safety. And there are other areas where you could save money. And if you want to keep the budget and cut it, there's a lot of defense programs that could be cut. There are defense programs that are not effectively keeping us safe from foreign problems or from foreign adversaries, but there are on our streets, and every city in this nation and every hamlet has the need for police. Such this cut to the COPS program is simply irresponsible, and it disregards the American public's regard and need for safety on the streets and safety in their communities. We should support our police, make our streets safer, and I'd ask that we support this amendment, and I'd ask that the people on the other side understand that law enforcement is a primary concern of government, and the reduction of this program and the elimination of this program will cost the American public dearly, and lives will be lost. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields his time back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I fully support the effort to restore funding to the COPS hiring program. We should absolutely look for savings and reduce costs in the federal budget, but we should not be withdrawing support for law enforcement while cities and towns across the country are struggling to maintain their police forces. A good example is Camden, New Jersey, which was forced by budget shortfalls to lay off 168 police officers last month. The city recently raised property taxes enough to restore about 20% of those positions, but law enforcement in the city is still woefully understaffed. The CR cuts COPS programs by $501 million, including a reduction of $298 million that specifically zeroes out the COPS hiring program. The elimination of COPS hiring would result in 1,330 fewer cops hired or rehired in FY11 compared to FY10, or 3,000 fewer cops hired or rehired in FY11 compared to the FY11 request of $600 million. Camden and many other cities and towns across the country still need federal assistance to help them get through this difficult economic period, and that is exactly what this amendment is designed to do. By restoring COPS funding for COPS hiring grants, Camden and other municipalities all across the country could get grants to cover the 3-year cost of rehiring officers they were forced to lay off, or hiring new officers they need but have been unable to afford. After 3 years, when the economy is expected to be in much better shape, these municipalities would be required to take on the costs of these officers. While I support the gentleman's amendment and strongly believe we should restore funding for the COPS program, I am deeply concerned about the offset the amendment relies upon. NASA's cross-agency support account funds for many of the vital efforts of NASA centers across the country. Currently, there is a backlog of deferred maintenance needs at NASA facilities, and this backlog has been growing at the rate of about 9% a year. Cutting funding for this account will only make NASA's maintenance backlog worse and will impede NASA's mission. We need to fund both NASA cross-agency support and COPS hiring at adequate levels, and I hope by the end of this process we can find a way to do that. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Oregon.
I first
Does
got
the gentleman move to strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is
or the requisite
recognized
number
for
of
5
words, or
minutes.
whatever is appropriate at this point in time. When I was first elected to office, I served with a very conservative Republican, and he used to say, government is about roads and rope. He's talking about the basis for, our system here in America. Basics, transportation, the Boston Post Road, the original roads of America that tied a young nation together, and rope. Law enforcement, here on earth, protecting American citizens from criminals. Now, somehow, the cross-agency support account, which is an unbelievable catch-all slush fund at NASA, which has grown in the last 2 years from $550 million to $3 billion, and will actually be increased in this continuing resolution by $36 million, is more important than defending the American people from criminals, from lawbreakers, from the most basic requirement of the government of the United States. Now, this isn't even like real stuff at NASA. It's not the fantasy about going to Mars or any of the other things they're engaged in for many billions of dollars. This is the cross-agency support budget, which has gone up 6 times, 600% in 2 years. And it's going to go up again here today, and we're going to slash the heck out of the COPS program. Now, go home and explain that to your constituents. Tell them, look, no, you can't even say look up there because it's not a satellite. It's not headed to the moon or to Mars. You just have to say, hey, it's the cross-agency support budget at NASA, and when the criminal's breaking down your door, call NASA. That probably isn't going to work too well. This not only supports police on the streets in overstretched agencies, it supports, and we've had a lot of talk about urban America, sheriffs in our rural areas, which are woefully unpoliced. And in my district, we've gotten money out of this account, which you're cutting by 65%, to go after methamphetamine manufacturing and Mexican cartels moving methamphetamine up the west coast of the United States. We're going to cut that 65% because it's more important that we fund the cross-agency support budget of NASA, and we increase it by 600% in 2 years, and we decrease funding for cops and sheriffs and drug reduction in our communities, in our schools, in our rural areas by 65%. Well, you go on home and campaign on that, and I'll be campaigning on my issues.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you move to strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We used to argue at one time on this floor whether or not to help communities to support their police department. We argued here on this floor as to whether this was a federal issue, whether the federal government had any responsibility in terms of firefighters, I remember the debates, and police officers. And we made a decision on a bipartisan basis that it was a responsibility because we needed to protect the homeland. So Democrats and Republicans supported the protection and trying to help communities fight crime and put out fires. We made that on a bipartisan basis. And it is a shame that we do not even consider the COPS program as part of Homeland Security. Because if you don't have it here, you have it nowhere. This is a security issue. It is a priority. How many officers in the past 2 months have been shot down doing their job in this country? Double last year. And we know that small communities and large communities have taken advantage of the COPS program. This is important to our community. I was a mayor of the third largest city in New Jersey. I know what those police officers on the street in the communities mean to protecting folks in my town, where I still live. I know the results. Since 1992, I know those results inside and out. You heard Mr. Weiner, who showed us the charts about what it has meant right across the United States of America. We're making a big mistake here. Throughout the United States of America, everybody, citizens know that when they see police officers walking the beat, they know there is a priority that the federal government has not forgotten. I ask you, you cannot do to police officers and you cannot do to firefighters what this budget, at least for the next 6 months, is being represented by the other side. We're going to take up a Fire Act pretty soon, the SAFER Act pretty soon with our firefighters. We can't do this. We can't pat them on the back and say, great job. We can't go to the parades and say, look at this. This is the protection we have in America, and do this in a program that's successful. No one has stood and questioned the success of either of these programs. No one. I haven't heard one word tonight. If the program wasn't working, if cops weren't doing their job on the beat, then you'd stand and you would defend that particular position. This is not the way to do it. This is not the way to protect the homeland. This is not the way to pat police officers on the back and then send them out there without the resources, and without their brothers and sisters fighting alongside of them to protect the United States of America. Mr. Chairman, this is a very serious problem. We argue vociferously on this floor to protect the soldier in the field in foreign lands. I'm here today to support DEFAZIO, Weiner, and the rest of the folks who've talked on this, to defend our police officers on the street. We owe them no less. I ask you to restore this money, the money that has been taken away in this 7-month budget. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's wise. And I yield back.
Yields back. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the pending amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment as offered by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New York.
And that I'd like to record and vote, please.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. Gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the CR's proposal before us proposes to cut $190 million from juvenile justice programs. That cut is short-sighted and misguided. Cutting effective crime prevention programs is penny-wise and pound-foolish because we have reams of research and demonstration programs to show that evidence-based crime prevention programs save a lot of money and avoided law enforcement, victim incarceration, and other expenditures, and actually save more than the programs cost. The current Justice Department is making excellent progress in assuring that crime prevention programs and funding are only used for those programs that have proven their effectiveness through vigorous evaluation and study, and programs that have shown their effectiveness. I can see that cutting unproven programs as a result of earmarks or that haven't gone through that vigorous demonstration would be appropriate, but the programs in the Justice Department should not be cut. Mr. Chairman, there are a lot of organizations that have written in opposition of the cuts in the juvenile justice programs. They include the National Disability Rights Network, the Campaign for Youth Justice, the Children's Law Center, the National Council for Community Behavioral Health Care, the After School Alliance, the Campaign for Fair Justice, Sentencing of Youth, and the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Mr. Speaker, last month we passed a tax bill that increased the deficit by $400 billion a year for 2 years. Now we obviously need to cut the budget to pay for those tax cuts, but cutting funding for juvenile justice programs that have proven to save more money than they cost is not the right thing to do. We need to defeat this bill and come back with a bill that fully funds the juvenile justice programs so that we can save money and reduce crime. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The clerk will read.
Page 204, line 16, section 1333. The percentage limitations on transfers between appropriations of the Department of Justice shall not apply to funds provided by this division or under previous appropriations acts to the Department of Justice that remain available for obligation or expenditure. Section 1334. The proviso limiting the use of funds under the heading National Aeronautics and Space Administration Exploration in Division B of Public Law 111-117 shall not apply to funds appropriated by this division. Section 1335. The level for National Aeronautics and Space Administration space operations shall be $5,946,800,000.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 78, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Olson of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of my amendment to shift funds in the NASA budget. I appreciate the work that Chairman Wolf and his colleagues have put into drafting this bill. I know how tough it must have been. We were elected to make tough decisions, to cut spending, and to put our fiscal house in order. In our nation's current fiscal situation, we must set clear and prudent guidelines on how our limited tax dollars are spent. I propose today that we set such limits within NASA to get better use out of our money. Climate research is currently being conducted in 16 different agencies, including NASA, and received over $35 billion through stimulus and last year's appropriations bills. Human spaceflight is conducted in exactly one agency, NASA. In this tight budget cycle, we must reduce duplicative spending and target our resources where they will be most beneficial. The 15 other agencies conducting climate research can pick up the slack while freeing up resources for NASA to make a truly unique contribution, maintaining U.S. dominance in human spaceflight. Accordingly, my amendment proposes to reallocate $517 million that could be spent on NASA science programs so that it will instead be available to maintain stable operations for human spaceflight. The amendment does not change the overall NASA funding level. It simply reallocates within the total. I understand the tough task this CR has been for our appropriators. It's never easy to tell people they must do more with less. NASA has been doing more with less for almost a decade, and that is why I'm offering this amendment. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss NASA priorities with Chairman Wolf and my colleagues. And I ask for Chairman Wolf's commitment to work with me going forward as we begin the appropriations process for fiscal year 2012 to ensure that we orient NASA away from duplicative climate research missions and back to its unique human spaceflight mission. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to Chairman Wolf for the purpose of engaging in a colloquy.
I thank the gentleman. It's my understanding the gentleman is withdrawing the amendment. I want to thank the gentleman for raising some critically important points about the value of NASA's human exploration program and the need to fully support it. And no one is a stronger supporter of NASA than the gentleman from Texas, except maybe Mr. Culberson, who's equally supportive. I share his concern with ensuring that exploration is adequately funded and that NASA remains on a clear path to achieve the human spaceflight goals laid out in last year's authorization. I'll be happy to work together as close as we possibly can to finish FY 2011 and move forward into FY 2012 to maintain a robust human spaceflight program at NASA, just as Mr. Olson would like it to be. In doing so, I agree that it will be necessary to identify and eliminate duplicative, wasteful, or lower priority activities in NASA's science program, or any other NASA account for that matter, so we can remain on a sustainable overall budget. I look forward to working with the gentleman and our colleagues to support NASA and thank him for his continuing efforts in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time is
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman very much. I rise to support the amendment that Mr. Olson has offered, and I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to work together collaboratively with the chairman and with Mr. Dix on this very important issue. I'd like to say publicly that Democrats and Republicans in the state of Texas have worked enthusiastically together on supporting NASA and human space exploration. I'm sorry that I would not have the opportunity to support Mr. Olson's amendment or vote for it. He is absolutely right. Human spaceflight is conducted in exactly one agency, NASA, and the general Houston area and Texas are impacted enormously. We've already lost 4,000 jobs. There will be a decrease of $1 billion going to NASA Johnson. That will impact the transition, if you will, in human space exploration. One very well-known member of our community, Captain Mark Kelly, the husband of our dear and beloved member, Congresswoman Giffords, will have the opportunity to be on one of the final shuttles. But what most of us are not aware of, because our memory fades us, is how much we gain from human space exploration. Research in HIV/AIDS, in stroke, in heart disease, in weather research, all improving the quality of life of Americans. And so I stand solidly behind continuing to fund human space exploration and join Mr. Olson in the leadership that he has given. This is a tight budget, but the President talked about investment, competitiveness, creating jobs. NASA creates jobs. It creates jobs for small businesses. It creates jobs for large contractors. It creates thousands upon thousands of jobs. And so I hope in this instance that we can speak in a bipartisan manner to speak to the administration on the value of continuing to support NASA. It is difficult when we have a CR that in fact is cutting millions from the NASA budget. And I would hope that there would be a recognition that it is important to put $517 million back into NASA as was offered by this amendment. I can't imagine a nation without the ability for young people to aspire to the heights that those who have gone on before, those who have been astronauts, those who have explored the skies, those who have done enormously important research on the various trips that have been taken that have provided the research, and as well the space station, which has been an enormous asset that has brought international partners together and helped develop science that could not be developed before. Having traveled to most of the centers that are under the NASA administration, each and every one that I've been to, there have been a quality of staff that have been doing their job in the name of progress for the American people. So I'm disappointed with this CR that has caused these enormous cuts, and I would hope that we have the opportunity to restore them. Where are we if we quash the genius of America? Where are we if we extinguish the dreams of young students and scientists around America? Where are we if we quash the jobs that can be created by science? NASA is an asset and a jewel, and I hope together in this Congress, and of course working together with the administration, we can realize it once and for all. Why we have to battle so hard for something that has done so much for the American people baffles me. And I look forward to the reinvestment in science and competitiveness. And I yield back, and I thank the gentleman for his leadership, and I hope we'll be able to work in a bipartisan manner.
Gentlelady yields back her time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to join my colleague, Representative Olson, in support of an amendment to transfer $517 million out of NASA's Climate Change Research Fund and into human space flight, a proven economic driver and job creator. This amendment sends a clear message to both the administration and the leadership of NASA that it is Congress' intent that human spaceflight should not and cannot be ignored or marginalized. As Representative Olson just mentioned, the purpose of this amendment is to highlight the administration's approach to NASA and the direction in which it's heading. At a time when unemployment is at 12% in Florida and 9% nationwide, and our country is facing trillion-dollar deficits, I believe that limited federal funds are better invested in NASA's human spaceflight program, not climate change research. Doing so will help put people back to work and stimulate the economy. For the last half-century, the United States has made a commitment to human space exploration, creating thousands of jobs and contributing to the economies of places like Central Florida, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. With the shuttle program winding down and the Constellation program no longer a priority for this administration, I want the American people listening today to understand the fear and uncertainty felt by hardworking families throughout Central Florida and the 24th District. They need to know the great benefits that NASA's human spaceflight program has brought to this nation in the past and how a policy shift from NASA administered human spaceflight to increased research on potential climate changes would devastate the economy of Central Florida and many other regions of our country. The facts are that in fiscal year 2010, the President designated $1.2 billion of NASA's total budget towards climate change research. This is on top of the 16 separate agencies and departments outside of NASA that spent an additional $8.7 billion on climate change research in the same fiscal year. Now the President's more funding for this type of research. As NASA's human spaceflight program hangs in the balance and the tens of thousands of jobs the program supports along with it, it is time for Congress to return NASA's directives and goals back to the congressional intent and the original agency mission, keeping America in front as a global leader in space exploration and helping to rebuild struggling communities in the process. In closing, I would like to thank Representative Olson and Posey for working with me in drafting this amendment, and to Chairman Wolf for agreeing to work with our offices as the regular fiscal year 2012 appropriation process proceeds. Thank you, and I yield back the rest of my time to Representative Olson.
I thank my colleague from Florida. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I withdraw my amendment.
The gentleman asked unanimous consent to withdraw his amendment. Seeing no objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'll be very brief since the gentleman withdrew the amendment. I'm a big fan and supporter of our manned spaceflight program, which I think has just an extraordinary record of achievement and enormously important to our position in the world in terms of our leadership in science. It's also very important to many of the space centers around the country in terms of the important jobs that it provides. But I don't want to see us rob Peter to pay Paul within the sciences, to go after the earth sciences budget, which is also critically important to the nation's future. When we look at some of the breathtaking and disastrous weather patterns that we have seen around the world, whether it was the incredible and tragic flooding in Australia or that in South America, the ability to understand better the nature of our climate and climate change is not only extraordinarily important in terms of saving lives, but in terms of understanding what is happening to our planet. We also derive a lot of commercial benefits from our investment not only in earth science, but space science as well. These investments pay enormous dividends in technologies that have become a part of all of our homes now. So this is an investment that I think we want to continue to make and make strongly. While I, again, am a fervent supporter of our manned spaceflight program, I don't think any one portion of our space budget or science budget ought to be cannibalizing the other. We do have to make sacrifices, and we're going to have to scrutinize every program that is not working well or not efficient, eliminate any waste, eliminate any even programs that are working but not working well enough. But in terms of our investment in the future, in terms of our investment of understanding our planet, it would be, I think, very short-sighted for us to be cutting those budgets and cutting that vital research. I thank the gentleman for withdrawing the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The clerk will read.
Page 206, line 8. Section 1336, the level for National Aeronautics and Space Administration cross-agency support shall be $3,131,000,000.
For purposes, the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise today to discuss an amendment that I filed with Mr. Wu of Oregon but will not be offering. Instead, in a minute, I will be engaging Chairman Wolf in a brief colloquy. Our goal is simple, to preserve funding at FY 2010 levels for two critical National Weather Service programs. We drafted this amendment because these are two programs that save lives. Many Americans might not realize it, but the weather forecasts we all get from the Internet, the Weather Channel, or from local TV or radio are all built on the raw data provided by the National Weather Service. These are the same weather reports that are relied upon every day by emergency responders, pilots, and sailors. My goal is to protect local warnings in forecast centers around the country, along with the Severe Storm Centers, the National Hurricane Center, and the Aviation Weather Center. Without these centers, we wouldn't have daily forecasts or flood warnings, and air travel would be significantly more dangerous. The National Weather Service has been essentially flat-funded since 1995. Much of their equipment is needed for repair or replacement. As a country, we simply cannot afford to cut back any further on a service that saves lives, allows us to plan for it and respond to weather emergencies, and enables air travel. I am concerned about the adverse impact that this cut could have on these essential services. I understand that my colleague from Virginia, Chairman Wolf, shares some of my concerns, and I'd like to engage in a brief colloquy on this topic. Mr. Chairman, I know that this legislation requires the Department of Commerce to produce a spending plan that explains how they will implement these cuts. Would you be willing to work with me to make sure the plan NOAA produces reflects the important work done by the National Weather Service and does not adversely affect critical services?
The gentleman would yield.
I yield.
I appreciate the gentleman's concern. He makes a very, very powerful point. I completely agree with him. These are important programs, as are many others in the bill, and we will ensure that as we review the FY 2011 spend plan, that all NOAA's important activities are sufficiently funded. I also, I might say, have a large weather service presence in my district and appreciate their hard work, and it's one of the more important things that NOAA does with regard to the weather. I thank the gentleman for withdrawing his amendment, and I look forward and promise to work with him on these issues to resolve it, that we protect the issues that the gentleman is raising.
Reclaiming my time, I want to thank Chairman Wolf. I appreciate your willingness to work with me on this important issue. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Everyone yields back his time. The clerk will read.
Page 206, line 18, Section 1337. The level for National Aeronautics and Space Administration construction and environmental compliance and remediation shall be $408,300,000. Section 1338. Transfer limitations described in the administrative provisions of Division B of Public Law 111-117 shall not apply to funds available under the following headings: National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Aeronautics, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Space Operations, and National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Education. Section 1339. None of the funds may be used for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration or the Office of Science and Technology Policy to participate, collaborate, or coordinate with China or any Chinese-owned company unless such activities are specifically authorized by a law enacted after the date of enactment of this division. Section 1340. Amounts are provided for Legal Services Corporation shall be modified by substituting $350 million for $420 million, $324,400,000 for $394,400,000.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 173, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Cohn of Tennessee.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
Point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Tennessee may proceed.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to offer this amendment, of which many members of the Judiciary Committee who've worked on behalf of legal services in the past, including thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many members of the Judiciary Committee have championed legal services over the years, none greater than Bobby Scott, who's a member of the committee and for some time, and the current ranking member, Mr. Conyers, Mr. Nadler, and Ms. Jackson Lee, and others. Legal services is so important to giving people representation. And this amendment will restore $70 million that's being cut from the Legal Services Corporation. That's 17.5% of the monies that Legal Services got in the past. Legal Services is already woefully underfunded. If you look at the funding they've gotten over the last 30 years and prorate it, they've been behind in funds for a long time. We've tried to make that up in the past years. The funding has turned away right now. They turn away half of all eligible clients who seek assistance. Slashing these funds would make it even worse. And the fact is, in these dire economic times, some of the worst we've seen, although they're getting better, more and more people need legal services. The housing crisis is not over with, and one of the major areas they work with is people who are having problems with foreclosures because of unscrupulous loans that they've been given. And there'll be more and more people losing their homes or potentially losing their homes needing legal services. And if they don't have legal representation and they lose those homes, neighborhoods are hurt, individuals are hurt, and that's a major cost on the economy. The Executive Director of Memphis Legal Area Services, Harrison McIver, said the cuts would be devastating to Memphis area legal services, and it would be devastating to their capacity to remain an effective advocate and resource for low-income individuals with all civil legal problems that they may have. It would require laying off at least 5 attorneys who would take 725 fewer cases. Memphis area legal services, as other legal service clinics, help victims of domestic violence as well with protective orders from abusive partners, as well as assisting folks with foreclosures and elderly people who have been victimized by predatory lenders. Think about how many victims of domestic abuse will be in danger without access to the courts, how many families will become homeless without this foreclosure assistance, and how many seniors will fall prey to predatory loans without legal help. How many of our vulnerable citizens will have the courthouse doors closed in their face? The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that legal services is more needed in dire economic times than any other time. And while cuts, and I understand the majority's positions about saying they were elected to make cuts, they weren't elected to make cruel cuts that hurt the most vulnerable people in situations that aren't of their own making, and that they fall prey to predatory lenders or abusive spouses or people who prey on seniors in abusive ways. This is targeting the most vulnerable people in our society. I realize that there isn't an offset on this, and I realize the reason Mr. Wolf has made his point. And I understand, too, somewhat, and feel a little bit of kinship with the Roman gladiators, who, when they went into the field of combat, told the emperor that we who are about to die salute you. And knowing kind of what the situation is, I also understand that Ave Imperator Moratori Tal Saliuant. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman from Virginia reserve his point of order?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's point of order is reserved. Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to speak in support of what my colleague from Tennessee has said. In the United States, access to justice shouldn't be available only for those who can afford it. I think most Americans recognize that we have a out-of-control deficit and debt, that we need tough action to deal with that, and I think Americans, irrespective of party, are ready to make sacrifices. The President's budget, I think, indicates that there are going to be some tough days ahead, and there are going to be some of the efforts that we have supported in the past we can't afford to support anymore. But at the same time, I think the American people recognize that there is a lot of waste in government that can be eliminated without harming people, that a lot of inefficiencies can and must be eliminated. But they also don't want, in these difficult economic times, for our first steps to be to take away vital resources from those who are most in need, or from middle-income families that are trying to stay in their homes. One of the reasons why legal services have been so busy in the last several years is because of the foreclosure crisis, where many who are being forced out of their homes, who can't afford counsel, have nowhere to turn, and have increasingly turned to legal services for help in trying to get them to stay in their home. Imagine what we're telling those families that are struggling to stay in their homes, that we are now going to defund the lawyer that's been helping them. I don't think that's where we need to go in order to balance our budget. Legal Services Corporation is the largest funder of legal services for low-income Americans and for the growing population of Americans who have no income because they can't find work. Legal Services helps ensure representation before courts is available to all Americans, no matter what their income, their station in life, or what their circumstances happen to be. LSC-funded programs help single women trying to keep their families together, victims of domestic violence, elderly Americans trying to avoid foreclosures, and an increasing number of veterans arriving home from the service in Iraq and Afghanistan who are unable to find jobs. Federal funding for LSC makes up only 40% of the operating income of those programs. The rest comes from state funding, support from the private bar, and funds from lawyer trust accounts. But the economy that is sending more people to the door of legal aid offices than at any time in history has also sapped those other sources of funding. The CR cuts legal services to the poor by $70 million. That's a 17% cut compared to the current level. Again, there's no question we need to find savings in the budget, and we are and we will. And we stand ready to work with our colleagues across the aisle to find cuts that make sense. But to make a drastic cut to a program at a time that's keeping people in their homes and where people are struggling most is not the not the most propitious place to find savings. And I yield back.
Gentleman for Virginia continue to reserve his point of order?
Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman continue to reserve?
I do.
For what purpose does the other gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman from Tennessee for offering the amendment and the gentleman from California for his remarks. Legal Services Corporation programs are forced to already reject over half the cases that come before them. This cut found in the CR only makes matters worse by requiring the firing of hundreds of Legal Services Corporation attorneys. Mr. Chairman, our justice system promises fairness to all litigants, but when people are unable to afford a lawyer, they are vulnerable to being ripped off in consumer transactions, vulnerable to unnecessary evictions, or unable to afford a divorce or resolve child custody disputes. Mr. Chairman, we need to make sure that justice is more than just an idea. One Supreme Court justice suggested that the kind of justice one gets should not depend on the amount of money they have. 2 months ago, we passed a tax cut that gave significant tax relief to multimillionaires. It would be tragic if Legal Services Corporation funding for legal aid lawyers was cut to help pay for those tax cuts to multimillionaires. Mr. Chairman, the Legal Services Corporation needs to be fully funded. We should defeat this CR and come up with a continuing resolution that fully funds the Legal Services Corporation. Again, I thank the gentleman from Tennessee and the gentleman from California and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized on his point of order. Does the gentleman reserve his point of order?
I reserve my point of order.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, if you stay around here long enough, you see very interesting things happen. As I look at my friend, and when I say my friend, I really mean that, Mr. Wolf, and I think of the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers, I'm reminded of the fact of two very interesting things. One, that it was Mr. Wolf and I and Mr. Rogers and I who made sure during some very difficult years a long time ago that the Legal Services Corporation would stay alive and grow and strengthen itself and support those who needed help in our community. And as I said, if you stay around long enough, then you see the other side, which is the same folks accepting a cut that would devastate this agency. The other irony is that this, as I said so many times years before when I was a ranking member on this committee, and some folks would try to cut, that this was Richard Nixon, President Nixon's baby. This was one of the highlights, I believe, of his career, that he felt that every American had the right to legal representation. And so in the times that we're in, and with the desire of some folks to go after certain agencies, the Legal Services Corporation becomes a good target. But it indeed is a bad target to go after, because as we hear more and more talk about protecting, supporting, and keeping the Constitution alive, what better show than to allow folks legal representation? When we say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all that has certain meaning to me, and it has certain meanings to all of us. But at the center of that may be the ability to have representation and to have your day in court. There are folks that can't afford a lawyer, and the Legal Services Corporation has helped them. Now, mind you, throughout the years, folks like myself have accepted the fact that they have great limitations placed on them. There are a lot of things they can't do, but there are still a lot of good things that they can do. So I would hope we could support this amendment, but more than that, I would hope that as we look forward, or look sadly forward, to this massive behavior of cuts across the board, that we realize that there are some basic needs and basic protections that we need. This is one of them, And this is a sad day indeed when I see so many of us who worked to preserve the Legal Services Corporation now engage in seeing perhaps its demise. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman from Virginia continue to reserve his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
To strike the requisite number of words.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I had intended to offer an amendment similar to Mr. Cohen's that strikes the elimination of $75 million. Rather than do that, I'm going to join in support of Mr. Cohen's amendment. Mine was striking the full $75 million that was being taken from the Legal Services Corporation. And I think it's difficult. Earlier today, I was on the floor explaining what a continuing resolution is, because I know more than my colleagues are listening. What would actually happen if this cut was to go through is frankly that the services to the poor, meaning cases who are now in court, cases that are proceeding, would be suspended in air. Frankly, you would deny justice to those who had begun to get some relief. This cut will impact 136 nonprofit legal services officers. It will frankly cut 300 legal aid attorneys, 136 offices across America. This $75 million will stop Mr. and Mrs. Jones in the middle of representation to save their home. This cut will stop Mrs. Smith from being able to get relief from a domestic violence situation, because her lawyer or that family's lawyer will be fired. This cut will stop someone who has been defrauded, some senior citizen who paid a contractor to fix their leaking roof in midstream will lose their lawyer. This is a denial of justice. And having had the privilege today of visiting the construction site of the Martin Luther King Memorial, it was interesting that I read these words: injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And for us to cut the very framework of the Constitution that calls for justice, I believe, is something that should halt us on the very floor of this House, and we should immediately accept the amendment without the point of order and allow these individuals to have the ability to be served. Frankly, this is beyond the imagination of any of us. The board chairman, John G. Levy of the Legal Services Board, said justice is a hollow promise without the Legal Services Corporation. He is absolutely right. And as I indicated, I too wanted to strike the elimination of $75 million from the Legal Services Corporation. But the greater insult is the fact that work that is proceeding as we speak would be eliminated. 300 lawyers, 136 nonprofit officers, and how many hundreds upon hundreds and maybe thousands of clients who would not have the opportunity to be served. So I'd ask my colleagues to consider what we do here in this place and to consider what a continuing resolution will do midstream, similar to the point that I made earlier about resources that could be taken from the section of the Department of Justice that would enforce the Voting Rights Act. It means that you would stop cases dealing with the enforcement of the right to vote. Let us not deny justice tonight, and I would ask my colleagues to support the taking away or the adding back, of the $70 million to the Legal Services Corporation. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman from Virginia insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just say I appreciate the comments of Mr. Serrano and the other members on the other side of the aisle. I share many of those concerns. However, as the chairman knows, there is not an offset to this bill, and the amendment proposes a net increase in budget authority in the bill. The amendment is not in order under Section 3J3 of House Resolution 5, 112th Congress, which states, quote, "It shall not be in order to consider an amendment to a general appropriations bill proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill unless considered in block with another amendment or amendments proposing an equal or greater decrease in such budget authority pursuant to Clause 2F of Rule 21. The amendment proposes a net increase in the budget authority in the bill. Therefore, it is in violation of such section. I ask for a ruling of the Chair."
Other member wish to be heard on the point of order? Seeing none.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
The lady from Texas.
I respect the Chairman, and I know that he has, as Mr. Serrano said, has his own commitment. I consider this an emergency and would only make the point that whether or not a point of order could be waived in light of the fact that cases that are now in litigation would be, in essence, left without representation either for the client or for the case. I consider it a legal emergency, an emergency dealing with justice questions, and I'd ask that the point of order be waived.
Does any other member wish to be heard on this point of order? Seeing none, the Chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman from Virginia makes a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee violates Section 3J3 of House Resolution 5. Section 3J3 establishes a point of order against an amendment proposing a net increase in budget authority in the pending bill. The Chair has been persuasively guided by an estimate from the Chair of the Committee on Budget that the amendment proposes a net increase in budget authority in the bill. Therefore, the point of order is sustained and the amendment is not in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take the full time here.
Does the gentleman seek to strike the last word?
Okay. Have an amendment to offer.
The gentleman's clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 10, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Duncan of South Carolina.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment deals with Legal Services Corporation, which is a relic from the Great Society, originally known in the 1960s as the Office of Economic Opportunity Legal Services, later renamed. Folks, let me remind you that we have a $1.5 trillion deficit spending and we have $14 trillion in debt. We can't afford to keep paying for liberal trial lawyer bailouts like the LSC. This is low-hanging fruit if we are serious about cutting spending in this body. This is exactly the kind of program that we would be cutting if we had a Byrd-style committee in place. That's why we need to pass House Resolution 82. But this amendment effectively zeroes out the LSC, allowing only a small amount for agency audits to continue. This cut is in the DeMint and Jordan Spending Reduction Act, which would eliminate the program entirely. A number of groups have advocated for the abolition of the LSC. Human Events describes the LSC as one of the top 10 most outrageous government programs. Stephen Moore in the Wall Street Journal calls LSC a slush fund for special interest, and the Americans for Limited Government's Bill Wilson says this corporation just serves as the legal arm for left-wing causes and should be abolished. In noting the LSC's penchant for taking cases it has been legislatively barred from being involved in, the Heritage Foundation declares, obviously, if LSC would stop wasting funds representing people it isn't supposed to, it would have more money to spend representing the needy people. The Americans for Tax Reform calls LSC ineffective and notes that their services are duplicated by state and private agencies. And just recently, the Cato Institute notes that the LSC too often uses tax dollars for lobbying and other political advocacy activities and adds that the LSC should be abolished. Again, I go back to the amount of debt that we have in this nation, the deficit spending that we have in this year's fiscal year. Again, this is low-hanging fruit, and if we are serious about cutting spending, this is an easy one for us to deal with. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from California.
Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, and I think the...
Do you move to strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman moves to strike the last word is recognized for 5 minutes.
We can have reasonable debates about the deficit situation and the actions that should be taken, but I don't think the hyperbole that we are hearing is adding to the quality of the debate. When the Legal Services Corporation is described as a trial lawyer bailout, I think it shows a fundamental misapprehension of what legal services does. For many Americans, tens of thousands of Americans who are at risk of having their house foreclosed out from under them, seeking assistance from legal services to stay in your home, that's not a trial lawyer bailout. I don't think people who go to legal services because they can't afford an attorney and desperately want to stay in their home feel like they're giving some kind of a bailout to trial lawyers when they go to the neighborhood legal services and ask for help to stay in their home. It's also been described as some kind of a bastion for left-wing causes. I don't think it's a left-wing cause to want to help people stay in their house. I don't think it's a left-wing cause when you have veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who need mental health services and need the advice of counsel and need the help of counsel to get services they're entitled to. I don't think that's a left-wing cause. I don't think it's a right-wing cause to want to foreclose on someone, and I don't think it's a left-wing cause to want to try to keep them in their home. I think, frankly, this ought to be all of our cause, that people through no fault of their own, who are hardworking but have lost their job as a result of the economy or have lost part of their income as a result of the economy and need help to stay in their home, and this is the only place they can get it, only place they can afford a lawyer, and anyone who's tried to hire a lawyer knows how expensive that is. I don't think that's a left-wing cause, and I just don't think it sheds much light on the debate. Are there things that can be cut? Yes. Is the President's budget cutting them? Yes. Are there more cuts we're going to have to find? Yes. But, you know, let's speak frankly about what this organization does and what it doesn't do. And if my colleagues have issue to take with a particular legal services branch in a particular city, then we should take that cause. And in our committee, the Commerce, Justice, Science Committee, with our chairman, Mr. Wolf, we do oversight to make sure that LSC funds aren't being used to lobby Congress, to make sure that only permissible purposes are funds being used for in LSCs around the country. And the LSCs, I think, over the last several years have done extraordinarily well under that oversight, and that oversight needs to continue. And where LSCs can operate more efficiently, they're going to have to, because it's not just a problem in terms of the federal budget, but all the states are cutting back as well. But I don't think we can really get to the heart of what we can, where we can afford to make cuts, where the cuts will inflict the least pain, if we're going to pejoritize the service of a lot of hardworking lawyers out there who work for legal services, many of them who offer their services pro bono, who get no compensation whatsoever for the work they provide, and try to demean them by saying this is a trial lawyer bailout. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Virginia.